My name is Sarah Coleman, and I'm 28 years old. Before I tell you about the night my parents put me out into a storm at 15 years old, and about the woman whose face made my father's hands start shaking 13 years later, I need you to understand the family I grew up in, because nothing about that night makes sense without it. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, in a house that always felt, even from the earliest years I can remember, like it was built around one child instead of two. My younger sister, Emily, was 2 years behind me, and from a very young age, there was an unspoken understanding in our house that her feelings, her needs, and eventually her word, simply carried more weight than mine did. I don't think my parents ever sat down and consciously decided this. I think it happened the way most family patterns happen, slowly, quietly, one small decision at a time, until an entire architecture had been built without anyone ever announcing it out loud. My father worked as a foreman at a manufacturing plant outside town, a steady, unglamorous job that kept food on the table and not much more. My mother stayed home for most of my childhood, managing the household with a kind of brisk efficiency that left very little room for anything she considered unnecessary emotional fuss. Between the two of them, there was a clear, if unstated, hierarchy of whose fuss actually counted as necessary. Emily's did. Mine, more often than not, didn't. I remember being around 8 years old, coming home from school with a stomachache I was fairly sure was serious, and being told by my mother, without much sympathy, to lie down and drink some water, that I was probably just tired. 2 weeks later, Emily complained of a nearly identical stomachache, and within the hour, my mother had her in the car headed to urgent care, canceling her own afternoon plans without a second thought. I didn't understand the difference between those two moments at the time, not in any way I could have articulated. I just quietly filed it away, the way children do, as one more small piece of evidence about where I actually stood in that house. Emily was, by almost any objective measure, a difficult child in ways that our parents consistently framed as simply sensitive or strong-willed rather than what an outside observer might have called manipulative, even from a fairly young age. She had a talent, even as a kid, for reshaping a story in the retelling so that she always came out the more sympathetic party, and our parents, for reasons I've spent years trying to understand, almost never questioned her version of events, even when the physical evidence in front of them plainly contradicted it. I remember, more than once, being blamed for things I hadn't done simply because Emily had cried convincingly enough, quickly enough, before I'd had a chance to explain my own side of whatever had happened. I want to be fair here and say I don't think Emily set out, as a small child, to be cruel or calculating in any deliberate sense. I think she learned, the same way I learned my own lessons, that a certain kind of performance got her exactly what she needed from our parents, and she simply became very good at it over time, the way any child becomes good at whatever strategy reliably works for them. The difference was that her strategy was rewarded, consistently, for years, while mine, quiet compliance, trying to stay out of trouble, rarely complaining, was treated less like a virtue and more like confirmation that I didn't need much attention in the first place. By the time I reached middle school, the pattern had become so consistent that I'd stopped expecting anything different. If Emily and I disagreed about something, my parents believed Emily. If something went missing or broke in the house, the assumption, more often than not, defaulted to me having been careless, even when there was no actual evidence pointing in my direction. I got used to a particular kind of quiet, resigned frustration, the specific ache of knowing you're being misjudged and understanding, at the same time, that arguing about it will only make things worse, will only get you labeled as difficult, as dramatic, as somehow proving the very accusation you're trying to defend yourself against. I found some refuge, during those years, in schoolwork and in a small circle of close friends who saw me more clearly than my own family seemed to. I threw myself into biology in particular, fascinated from an early age by the way small, careful observation could eventually explain something that looked, at first glance, completely mysterious, a fascination that would end up shaping the entire direction of my adult life, though I had no way of knowing that yet at 13 or 14. Sitting at the kitchen table with a library book about cellular biology while my parents fussed, in the next room, over some minor crisis of Emily's. What none of us could have predicted, in those relatively ordinary years of quiet imbalance and small daily unfairness, was how quickly and how completely that imbalance was about to escalate, not into another small unfairness I could simply file away and move past, but into a single, devastating night that would end with a 15-year-old girl standing alone in a thunderstorm, and a family that had finally, unmistakably, shown her exactly where she actually stood. The lie that eventually cost me my home started, as far as I've ever been able to piece together, with a piece of jewelry, a gold bracelet that had belonged to our grandmother, left to my mother when she passed, and kept in a small wooden box on top of my mother's dresser, the kind of object that had always carried more sentimental weight in our house than its actual value. It disappeared on a Thursday in late September, the year I was 15. I remember the day mostly because of how it started, completely ordinary, and how quickly it stopped being ordinary once my mother came downstairs that evening holding the empty wooden box, her face already set into an expression I recognized from 100 smaller incidents over the years, the specific look of someone who had already decided what had happened before actually investigating it. She asked, first, in a general way, whether either of us had seen the bracelet. Emily answered immediately, her voice carrying exactly the right note of concern, that she hadn't touched it, that she'd actually noticed, a few days earlier, that I'd been in our parents' room for a while one afternoon while folding laundry, and that she'd thought it was strange at the time but hadn't wanted to say anything. I remember staring at her while she said this, genuinely confused, because I had, in fact, been in our parents' room briefly that week, exactly as she described, putting away a stack of clean towels the way I did most weeks as part of my regular chores, an entirely mundane detail that Emily had apparently filed away, waiting for exactly the right moment to redeploy it. I told my mother, as calmly as I could manage given how quickly the room's temperature seemed to be dropping, that yes, I had been in their room folding laundry, but that I hadn't touched the bracelet, hadn't even opened the box, and had no idea where it had gone. I asked, reasonably I thought, whether anyone had checked if my mother had simply moved it herself, or whether it might have fallen behind the dresser, or whether Emily herself might know more than she was letting on, given how specifically she'd noticed and remembered my presence in that room days earlier. That last suggestion, more than anything else I said that evening, seemed to genuinely offend my mother, as though the mere idea that Emily might be lying was itself a kind of betrayal on my part, separate from and somehow worse than the actual theft she was already halfway convinced I'd committed. She told me, her voice tight with an anger that felt entirely disproportionate to the amount of actual evidence in the room, that she couldn't believe I would try to turn this around on my own sister, that Emily had no reason to lie about something like this, and that the timeline, my presence in the room, the missing bracelet discovered shortly after, spoke for itself. I want to pause here and describe, as clearly as I can, exactly how it felt to be 15 years old, standing in my own living room, watching my mother construct an entire narrative of my guilt out of nothing more than circumstantial timing and my sister's carefully placed comment, while offering no actual proof of anything at all. It felt like drowning in slow motion, watching the people who were supposed to know me best choose, without hesitation, a story that made me the villain over a version of events that would have required them to consider, even briefly, that their younger daughter might not be as innocent as she'd always presented herself. My father came home partway through this unfolding scene, and I remember hoping, with a kind of desperate, naive optimism, that he might bring some measure of fairness to the situation that my mother's anger seemed incapable of providing. He didn't. He listened to my mother's summary of events, glanced briefly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and then, almost immediately, sided with her assessment, adding his own contribution to the case being built against me by mentioning, unhelpfully, that I'd always been a little sneaky about certain things, a vague, unsupported characterization that had no actual basis I could identify, but that landed with the weight of established fact in that room, simply because he was the one saying it. Over the following days, the accusation calcified into something my parents treated as settled truth rather than an unresolved question. My mother searched my room twice, thoroughly, finding nothing, which she interpreted not as evidence of my innocence but as proof that I'd hidden the bracelet somewhere clever, or perhaps already sold it, a theory that grew more elaborate and more convinced of itself with each passing day, entirely untethered from any actual evidence. Emily, throughout this entire stretch, played her role with a consistency that, looking back now as an adult, I can recognize as genuinely skilled performance, tearful when questioned directly, quietly supportive of our parents' suspicions without ever seeming to push too hard, careful never to overplay her hand in a way that might invite scrutiny of her own account. I tried, several more times over those days, to defend myself, to point out the total absence of any actual proof, to ask why nobody seemed interested in examining Emily's story with anywhere near the same scrutiny mine was receiving. Each attempt seemed to only deepen my parents' conviction rather than shake it, as though my continued insistence on my own innocence was itself further evidence of guilt, the classic, exhausting trap of being disbelieved, where every defense you offer gets reinterpreted as further proof of the very thing you're trying to disprove. By the end of that week, the household had settled into a kind of cold, simmering tension that I'd never experienced before, even accounting for years of smaller unfairness. My parents' distrust wasn't quiet anymore. It was active, present in every interaction, every meal, every brief exchange, and I remember lying in bed one of those nights, staring at the ceiling, feeling a kind of fear I couldn't fully name yet, some instinct warning me that this particular incident was different from all the smaller ones that had come before it, that something about the way my parents were looking at me now suggested this was building toward a breaking point none of us had reached yet, but that felt, unmistakably, close. The breaking point I'd sensed building all that week finally arrived on a Friday evening, 9 days after the bracelet first went missing, during what should have been an ordinary family dinner. I remember the weather that night with unusual clarity, because it feels, even now, 13 years later, almost too fitting to be real. A serious storm had been forecast all afternoon, the kind of warning that gets repeated on local radio, and by the time we sat down to eat, you could already hear the first heavy gusts of wind pushing against the windows, the sky outside gone a strange, heavy green-gray that meant business. The argument started over something almost absurdly small, Emily mentioning, in passing, that she'd noticed I'd been avoiding her all week, delivered in a tone calibrated perfectly to sound wounded rather than accusatory, the kind of comment designed to make me look defensive no matter how I responded to it. I said something back, sharper than I intended, exhausted after 9 days of being treated like a criminal in my own home, exhausted from defending myself against an accusation nobody seemed interested in actually investigating. I don't remember my exact words. I remember only that they were enough to make my mother slam her fork down on the table and demand to know why I couldn't simply own up to what I'd done instead of continuing to make things difficult for everyone. Something in me finally broke open at that point, 9 days of swallowed frustration coming out all at once, and I said things I probably shouldn't have said, about how unfair the entire situation was, about how nobody had ever once considered that Emily might be lying, about how exhausted I was of being blamed for things I hadn't done simply because it was easier for everyone to believe the version of events that didn't require questioning my sister. I was crying by that point, and shouting, in a way I'd genuinely never allowed myself to do in that house before, years of careful, quiet compliance finally giving way all at once. My father stood up from the table at that point, and I remember the specific, terrible finality in his voice when he spoke, a tone I'd never heard him use before, not even close. He said he was done, that he wasn't going to keep living with a daughter who lied to his face and then had the audacity to accuse her own sister of the same thing, and that if I couldn't be honest with this family, then I didn't need to be part of it. I told him, through tears, that I hadn't lied about anything, that I was telling the truth, that he was choosing to believe Emily simply because it was easier, and I asked him, one more time, why nobody had bothered to actually look for real evidence instead of just deciding I was guilty based on nothing but timing and Emily's word. That's when my mother said the words I've carried with me, word for word, for 13 years. She stood up beside my father, her face flushed with an anger that felt, even in the moment, disproportionate to anything actually happening in that kitchen, and she said, "Get out. I don't need a sick daughter." I remember the specific strangeness of that word, sick, a word that had nothing at all to do with theft or lying, a word that seemed to come from some entirely different, older frustration I didn't fully understand in that moment and wouldn't fully understand for years afterward, some deeper resentment about my quiet, difficult, less easily managed nature that had apparently been building far longer than 9 days, finally surfacing in the ugliest possible way at the worst possible moment. I stood there in the kitchen, 15 years old, soaked already just from the walk between the car and the front door earlier that evening, listening to the wind picking up outside, genuinely unable to process, for several long seconds, that my own mother had just told me to leave, in the middle of an actual storm warning, over an accusation nobody had bothered to actually prove. My father didn't soften what my mother had said. He didn't step in, didn't suggest we all take a breath and talk about this more calmly once emotions had cooled. He simply stood there, arms crossed, his expression as hard and unmoving as I'd ever seen it, and when I looked at him, silently pleading for him to say something different, he said only, "You heard your mother." Emily, throughout all of this, stood off to the side of the kitchen, not saying anything, her expression difficult to read even now in memory, somewhere between shock at how far things had escalated and something else I couldn't quite name at the time, something I've had a lot of years since to think about and still haven't fully resolved my feelings toward. I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door, mostly on autopilot, some part of my brain still refusing to believe this was actually happening even as my body moved through the motions of leaving. I don't remember exactly what I said on my way out, if I said anything coherent at all. I remember only the door closing behind me, the specific sound of the deadbolt turning almost immediately afterward, and then the full force of the storm hitting me all at once, rain coming down in sheets, wind strong enough to nearly knock me sideways, the temperature dropping fast enough that I could feel it immediately through my thin jacket. I stood on the front porch for a moment, genuinely unsure what to do, some part of me still expecting the door to open again, expecting my father to come out and tell me this had all been a terrible overreaction, that I could come back inside. The door stayed closed. The porch light, which had been on when we sat down for dinner, went dark a few minutes later, my mother apparently deciding there was no reason to keep it lit for a daughter she'd just decided she didn't need. I started walking, because staying on that porch, in that storm, with no sign of the door reopening, felt worse than moving, even though I had no real destination in mind, no phone with any battery left, and no understanding yet of just how badly that single decision, to start walking, alone, in the dark, in a storm severe enough to have its own weather warning, was about to change the entire remaining trajectory of my life, in ways none of us standing in that kitchen could have possibly predicted. I walked for what felt like a very long time, though I've never been able to reconstruct exactly how long it actually was, because everything about that stretch of the evening exists in my memory now as a series of disjointed, half-formed impressions rather than a clear, continuous sequence. I remember the rain finding its way through my jacket almost immediately, soaking through to my skin within the first few minutes. I remember the streetlights along our road, spaced further apart than I'd ever really noticed before, casting long, distorted pools of orange light that seemed to swallow up again into total darkness almost as quickly as they appeared. I remember, at some point, starting to shiver hard enough that my teeth were chattering, some distant, practical part of my brain registering that I was cold in a way that was becoming genuinely dangerous, even as the larger, more overwhelming part of me was still simply trying to process what had just happened in that kitchen. I didn't have a clear destination. I think, looking back, some part of me was walking toward my friend Rachel's house, roughly 2 miles away, though I couldn't have told you that with any real certainty in the moment, my thinking clouded by cold and shock and the particular kind of disorientation that comes from having the ground of your entire life pulled out from under you with almost no warning. I stayed close to the edge of the road because there weren't proper sidewalks on that stretch, the kind of quiet residential street where drivers rarely expected pedestrians at all, let alone at night, in a storm severe enough that visibility had dropped to almost nothing. I don't remember the actual moment of impact with any real clarity, and I've come to understand, over the years, that this kind of gap is common after a traumatic head injury. The brain simply doesn't lay down memory properly in the seconds immediately surrounding that kind of event. What I do remember, in fragments, is the sound first, a kind of low roar that I initially processed as thunder before some other part of my brain recognized it as an engine, too close, too fast. I remember a flash of headlights cutting briefly through the rain, and then very little else until fragments of awareness afterward, lying on wet pavement, unable to fully understand why I couldn't seem to get my body to respond the way I wanted it to, rain still falling directly onto my face, a sharp, overwhelming pain somewhere that I couldn't immediately localize through the general fog of shock. The driver, I learned much later, was a woman in her mid-50s on her way home from a late shift, driving carefully given the conditions but simply unable to see me in time on a dark, rain-soaked road with no sidewalk and a 15-year-old girl walking too close to the edge of it in near-zero visibility. She wasn't at fault, not really, not in any way the eventual police report suggested, and I've never once, in the years since, held any anger toward her for what happened. If anything, I've felt an enormous, permanent debt of gratitude, because she was the one who called for help immediately, who stayed with me on that road in the pouring rain until the ambulance arrived, who later told the paramedics everything she'd observed with a clarity that likely made a real difference in how quickly I was properly treated. I have only the barest fragments of memory from the time between the impact and actually arriving at the hospital, flashing lights reflected in puddles, the specific, disorienting sensation of being lifted onto a stretcher, a paramedic's voice, calm and steady, asking me questions I don't think I was able to answer coherently. I remember, at some point during that blur, someone asking for my name, for my parents' phone number, and I remember a strange, sharp spike of something like panic cutting through the shock and pain, some part of me still processing, even in that state, the fact that the people they were about to call had, less than an hour earlier, locked their front door behind me and turned off the porch light. What I learned afterward, piecing it together over the following days from hospital staff and eventually from the police report itself, was that my injuries had been serious enough to require immediate surgery, a fractured pelvis, significant internal bleeding, a head injury severe enough that the attending doctors had genuinely been uncertain, in those first critical hours, whether I was going to survive the night at all. I spent nearly 6 hours in surgery that evening, unconscious for all of it, entirely unaware of anything happening around me, including, as it turned out, some of the most important developments of that entire night, developments involving a phone call the police made to my parents' house, informing them that their daughter had been struck by a vehicle and was in critical condition, and a decision my parents made, in the immediate aftermath of that call, about whether and how quickly to actually come. I wouldn't learn the full details of what happened at my parents' end of that phone call, or what happened in the hours immediately following it, until much later, not until I was conscious again, stable again, and slowly, carefully, being told by hospital staff and eventually by the woman sitting quietly in the chair beside my bed, about everything that had unfolded while I lay unconscious on an operating table, entirely unaware that the single worst night of my life was, in its own strange and unexpected way, about to become the beginning of something that would eventually save it. The police called my parents' house a little after 10 that night, roughly 40 minutes after the accident, informing them that their 15-year-old daughter had been struck by a vehicle and was being taken into emergency surgery at the regional hospital roughly 20 minutes from our house. I've since read the incident report myself, years later, and the responding officer's notes describe the call being answered by my mother, who reportedly asked, before anything else, whether I was going to be all right, a detail I've turned over in my mind many times since, trying to reconcile it with the woman who had, less than an hour earlier, told me to get out because she didn't need a sick daughter. Whatever they felt in that moment, Whatever mixture of shock and fear and possibly guilt passed through either of my parents when they got that call, it apparently took them nearly 2 hours to actually arrive at the hospital. I don't know the full reason for that delay to this day, whether it involved an argument about who should go, whether it involved simply not believing the severity of the situation until a follow-up call from hospital staff made it unmistakably clear, or something else entirely that neither of them has ever fully explained to me. What I do know, because hospital records later confirmed it, is that I was already out of surgery and settled into the ICU by the time my parents finally walked through the hospital doors that night. I was still unconscious when they arrived, deep in the kind of heavy, medically necessary sleep that follows major surgery, and so I have no direct memory of what happened next, only the account given to me afterward, first by hospital staff, and much later, in far more detail, by the woman who had, by that point, already been sitting quietly in the chair beside my bed for well over an hour. According to the nurse who was on duty that night, and who later became something of an unexpected ally to me during my recovery, my father walked into the ICU room first, my mother a step or two behind him, both of them clearly shaken, clearly unprepared for the sight of me hooked up to monitors and 4 lines, bruised and bandaged in ways that made the severity of what had happened impossible to minimize any further. But it wasn't the sight of me, according to the nurse, that produced the most dramatic reaction in that room. It was the sight of the woman already sitting quietly in the chair beside my bed, a woman my father clearly recognized on sight, and whose presence there seemed to affect him far more visibly than anything else in that entire room. The nurse described my father stopping dead in the doorway, his face going pale, his hands, she remembered this detail specifically, because it struck her as strange enough to mention later, beginning to visibly shake. She said he stood frozen for what felt like a long moment before finally managing to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, saying only, "You can't be here." The woman, according to the nurse's account, didn't stand, didn't raise her voice, didn't respond with anything close to the alarm my father's reaction might have suggested was warranted. She simply looked at him, calm and utterly composed, and said that she had every right to be exactly where she was, that she'd been contacted by the hospital as part of a standard notification protocol given her professional role, and that she intended to stay, regardless of how uncomfortable her presence might be making him. My mother, standing just behind my father, apparently said nothing at all during this initial exchange, though the nurse recalled her expression shifting through something like confusion and then, more slowly, something closer to recognition of her own, as though she, too, understood exactly who this woman was, and exactly why her presence in that room carried a weight far beyond that of an ordinary hospital visitor. I remained unconscious through all of this, my body working through the aftermath of major surgery, entirely unaware that the 2 people who had, hours earlier, locked me out of my own home in the middle of a storm, were now standing in a hospital room being confronted, without warning, by someone from what I would soon learn was a part of my father's past he had apparently gone to considerable lengths, over many years, to keep entirely separate from the family he'd built afterward. It would be another full day before I was conscious and lucid enough to understand any of this myself, and even longer before I finally heard, directly from the woman herself, sitting patiently beside my hospital bed exactly where she'd been from the very first night, the full and genuinely astonishing explanation for who she actually was, how she had come to be notified about my accident before my own parents had even fully processed what had happened, and why my father's hands had been shaking badly enough for a hospital nurse to specifically remember and describe it, years later, as one of the strangest things she'd ever witnessed in that ICU. I woke up for the first time roughly 36 hours after the accident, groggy and disoriented in the particular way that follows major surgery and heavy sedation, the room around me slowly resolving into focus through a haze of pain medication and lingering confusion. The first clear thing I remember seeing was a woman I didn't recognize, sitting in a chair pulled close to my bed, watching me with an expression of quiet, careful attention that felt, somehow, immediately different from the anxious, distracted concern I associated with my own parents. She introduced herself once it was clear I was lucid enough to understand her, her voice calm and steady in a way that felt deliberately soothing, the practiced calm of someone who had clearly spent a career learning how to speak to frightened, injured young people. Her name was Diane Whitcomb, she told me, and she worked as a child welfare investigator for the county, a job that had brought her into contact with my family once before, many years earlier, under circumstances I had absolutely no memory of at all, since I had been barely more than an infant at the time. Over the following days, as I slowly recovered and grew strong enough to have longer, more detailed conversations, Diane explained the fuller picture, carefully and patiently, clearly conscious of not overwhelming me while I was still recovering both physically and emotionally from everything that had happened. 16 years earlier, when I was not quite 1 year old, a neighbor had made a report to the county's child welfare office expressing concern about conditions in our house, specifically, concerns about how my mother had been coping during a period of what the neighbor described, in her original statement, as visible postpartum distress, combined with reports of my father's temper during that same stretch, incidents overheard through thin apartment walls that had worried the neighbor enough to eventually call it in. Diane had been the investigator assigned to that case. She told me she remembered it distinctly, even all these years later, because something about the visit had never sat right with her, even after the case was formally closed. She'd interviewed my parents, observed the home, and ultimately found insufficient grounds to escalate the case further, largely because my father, she explained with a kind of clinical honesty I appreciated even through my own shock at hearing all of this, had been remarkably skilled at presenting exactly the right version of events during her visit, calm, reasonable, appropriately concerned, giving her nothing concrete enough to act on, despite an instinct she'd never quite been able to shake, that something underneath that calm presentation hadn't been entirely genuine. The case was closed, officially, within a few months, logged and archived the way thousands of similar cases are every year across the county, most of them never revisited again. Diane told me she had thought about our family periodically over the years that followed, an occupational habit she said she'd never fully been able to turn off, the particular unease of a case that technically resolved without incident but had never quite felt resolved to her on a deeper level. When the hospital's automated notification system flagged my case that night, standard protocol, she explained, whenever a minor is admitted with injuries consistent with certain patterns, even accidental ones, if there's a prior welfare file attached to the family, her name came up as the original investigating officer from 16 years earlier, and the system had automatically alerted her, as the historically assigned caseworker, that a minor from that same household had been admitted in critical condition following what the initial report described only vaguely as a pedestrian incident during severe weather. She told me she'd come to the hospital that night purely out of professional obligation, expecting, at most, a brief formality before handing the case off to whoever was currently assigned to active welfare matters in the area. What she hadn't expected, she said, was to arrive and learn, from the attending physician, additional details about the circumstances surrounding my presence alone on that road, at night, in a severe storm, details that, combined with her long-buried unease about that original case 16 years earlier, had made her decide, on the spot, that she wasn't simply going to hand this one off to someone else. This, she explained, was exactly what my father had reacted to so strongly the moment he walked into that hospital room. It wasn't simply the surprise of an unfamiliar face beside my bed. It was the specific, unmistakable recognition of a woman who had once sat across from him in his own living room 16 years earlier, asking careful, probing questions he'd worked hard to successfully deflect, and whose presence now, at the worst possible moment, represented exactly the kind of scrutiny he had spent over a decade successfully avoiding. I sat with all of this for a long time after Diane finished explaining it, processing not just the specific facts of what she'd told me, but the larger, more unsettling shape of what it suggested, that the pattern I'd lived inside of for 15 years, the quiet, persistent unfairness, the readiness to believe the worst of me, the ease with which I'd been discarded during a storm, wasn't simply an isolated failure of judgment on one particularly bad night. It was, according to a professional who had been watching this family from a careful distance for 16 years, part of something considerably older and more established than that single night alone, a pattern significant enough that a stranger, sitting quietly beside my hospital bed, had decided, the moment she recognized my father's face in that doorway, that this time, she wasn't going to simply close the file and walk away. The weeks following that conversation with Diane moved quickly in some ways and painfully slowly in others, the particular contradiction of hospital recovery, where physical healing follows its own unhurried timeline even while the rest of your life feels like it's rushing forward without you. Diane opened a new welfare investigation almost immediately, this time armed not just with a 16-year-old case file and a professional hunch, but with a detailed account from me, once I was well enough to give one, of the accusation over the bracelet, the escalating week of suspicion, and finally, the night itself, being told to get out, being locked out into a severe storm, alone, at 15 years old. I won't detail every step of the legal and administrative process that followed, partly because much of it moved through channels I only partially understood at the time, and partly because I think the practical mechanics matter less here than what actually happened to me as a result of them. What I can say is that the investigation moved quickly enough, and the evidence, including statements from the responding police officer, hospital documentation, and eventually testimony from my own recovering perspective, was serious enough that returning to my parents' house was never seriously considered as an option once I was medically cleared to leave the hospital. Diane, through a combination of her professional connections and what I've come to understand, looking back, was a genuine, personal determination to make sure this particular case didn't simply get handed off and forgotten the way so many others eventually do, arranged for me to be placed with a foster family she knew personally and trusted completely, a retired teacher and her husband, both in their early 60s, who lived about 40 minutes from my hometown and who had fostered several teenagers over the years, always, according to Diane, with a quiet, steady consistency that made them exactly the right fit for someone who had just learned, in the most painful way possible, how unreliable the adults in her life could actually be. I want to be honest about how difficult that adjustment period actually was, because I think it's important not to romanticize it into something simpler or more immediately triumphant than it really was. I spent much of that first year angry, in ways I didn't always know how to direct productively, grieving a family and a home that had never actually been as safe as I'd once believed it to be, and struggling with the specific, disorienting loneliness of starting over in a new school, a new town, a new life, while my body was still healing from injuries serious enough that I walked with a noticeable limp for the better part of a year. Diane, throughout all of this, remained a steady, consistent presence in my life in a way I hadn't expected from someone whose professional involvement, technically, could have ended the moment the placement was finalized. She checked in regularly, well beyond what her caseload officially required, and I came to understand, over time, that this wasn't simply professional diligence. It was something closer to a genuine, personal investment in making sure that the girl she'd found sitting unconscious in that hospital bed actually got the chance to build the kind of life that 16 years earlier, she'd worried, correctly, as it turned out, she might never get. It was Diane who first noticed, during one of our regular conversations about how school was going, how animated I became whenever the subject drifted toward biology, toward the specific fascination I'd carried since childhood, with careful observation revealing something that looked, at first, entirely mysterious. She was the one who encouraged me to join my new school's science program more seriously, who drove me, more than once, to weekend academic competitions that my foster parents' schedules couldn't always accommodate, who sat with me at my kitchen table some evenings helping me work through applications for summer research programs I wouldn't have had the confidence to pursue on my own. I threw myself into my studies during those years with an intensity that I think, looking back, was partly genuine passion and partly something closer to a coping mechanism, a way of building something entirely my own, entirely under my own control, in a world that had recently proven itself capable of taking everything else away without warning. It worked, in the sense that matters most. I finished high school with strong enough grades and strong enough research experience, gained through a summer program Diane had helped me apply to earn admission to a solid state university with a partial academic scholarship, something I'd built almost entirely through my own effort, with Diane's steady, patient support in the background the entire way. I remember the day I got my acceptance letter, sitting at my foster parents' kitchen table, Diane there for what had become one of our regular Sunday check-ins, and the quiet, fierce pride on her face when I showed her the letter, a look I'd never once seen from either of my biological parents, in 15 years of trying, in various small ways, to earn exactly that kind of recognition and never quite managing it. I remember thinking, in that moment, that I finally understood something I hadn't fully grasped before, that the family who shows up for you isn't always the family you're born into, and that recognizing the difference, once you finally see it clearly, changes the entire shape of what you're able to build for yourself going forward. None of us, sitting at that kitchen table celebrating a university acceptance letter, had any real sense yet of just how far that foundation was eventually going to carry me, or that the very same instinct for careful, patient observation that had first drawn me to biology as a lonely, overlooked child was, in time, going to lead me back into a spotlight far larger than any of us could have imagined that day, on a stage that would eventually put me back in the same room as the family who had once locked me out into a storm. University gave me something I hadn't fully realized I'd been missing for most of my life, a space where my quiet, careful, observation-driven nature wasn't treated as a liability to be managed, but as an actual asset, valued and rewarded on its own terms. I majored in biology, as I'd planned, and found myself drawn increasingly toward research rather than clinical work, fascinated by the slow, methodical process of asking a careful question and building, piece by piece, an answer that could withstand scrutiny. I threw myself into research opportunities from my very first year, working in a genetics lab under a professor who became an important early mentor, spending long hours in that lab that I never once experienced as a burden, unlike so much of what had been asked of me growing up. There was something deeply satisfying, I found, about a discipline where the truth of a result didn't depend on who told the most convincing story, or who cried more quickly, or who had spent years cultivating the right kind of sympathy from the people around them. In a lab, evidence was evidence. Data didn't lie the way people sometimes did, and I think some part of me, still healing from years of being disbelieved despite having the truth on my side, found genuine comfort in a field built entirely around that principle. I finished my undergraduate degree with honors and was accepted into a well-regarded doctoral program studying developmental biology, specifically focused on early childhood health outcomes, a research direction I chose deliberately, though it took me a few years to fully articulate, even to myself, exactly why that particular subject had drawn me in so strongly. Diane, by that point, had become less of a caseworker in my life and more of something closer to family, a relationship that had evolved naturally over the years into regular calls, holiday visits, the kind of steady, unforced closeness that I'd once assumed only existed between people who shared actual blood. Graduate school was demanding in ways that tested me repeatedly, long stretches of failed experiments and setbacks that would have felt, at an earlier point in my life, like further confirmation that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong, that eventually someone was going to see through whatever progress I'd managed to make and reveal me as the fraud some deep, old part of me still occasionally feared I was. But I'd built, by that point, enough of a foundation, in Diane, in the mentors I'd found along the way, in a slowly, carefully constructed sense of my own actual worth, built on real evidence rather than anyone else's approval, that those setbacks stopped feeling like referendums on my value as a person and started feeling, instead, like exactly what they actually were: a normal, expected part of doing difficult, meaningful work. It was during my final year of doctoral research, working on a project examining how early childhood instability affected long-term developmental outcomes, that I found myself thinking, more and more deliberately, about young people who'd lived through experiences similar to my own, kids who'd aged out of difficult family situations, sometimes through the foster system, sometimes through other paths entirely, and who faced enormous, often invisible barriers to pursuing higher education, not because they lacked ability or drive, but because they lacked exactly what I'd been lucky enough to find in Diane: a single, consistent adult willing to show up, over and over, without needing anything in return. I began, somewhat informally at first, mentoring a couple of local high school students through a community program near my university, teenagers navigating foster placements or unstable housing situations while trying to keep their academic goals alive despite circumstances that made even basic stability feel like an ongoing struggle. What started as a small, personal commitment gradually grew, over the following 2 years, into something considerably larger and more structured, as I began working with university administrators and eventually outside donors to formalize what would become the Second Chances Scholarship Program, a fund specifically designed to provide both financial support and, just as importantly, sustained mentorship to young people transitioning out of unstable or unsafe family situations and into higher education. I completed my doctorate and accepted a research position at a university-affiliated institute focused on childhood development, continuing both my academic work and my growing involvement with the scholarship program, which had, by that point, expanded well beyond its original small, informal beginnings into a genuine, structured initiative supporting dozens of students each year. I found, in that combination of research and mentorship, a kind of purpose that felt, for the first time in my adult life, entirely whole, using the careful, evidence-based thinking that had first drawn me to biology as a lonely 15-year-old, in service of exactly the kind of young person I'd once been myself, before a stranger sitting quietly in a hospital chair had decided my case deserved more than a routine, forgettable closing. By the time I turned 28, the program had grown enough, and my own research profile had developed enough, that I occasionally received invitations to speak publicly about both university panels, small conferences, the occasional local news segment about programs supporting foster youth in higher education. I accepted these invitations selectively, still, in many ways, more comfortable in a lab than in front of an audience, but understanding, increasingly, that telling my own story clearly and honestly was itself part of the work, a way of making visible exactly the kind of young person the scholarship program existed to serve. I had no way of knowing, when I accepted an invitation that spring to deliver a keynote address at a university graduation ceremony roughly 90 minutes from my hometown, that I was about to walk into a room containing, entirely without my prior knowledge, both the sister whose lie had once cost me my home, and the parents who had chosen to believe her over their own daughter 13 years earlier, an unplanned, entirely unexpected collision between the life I'd built for myself and the life I'd been forced out of, arriving at exactly the moment I least expected it, on a stage I'd been invited to specifically because of the story I was about to tell, without knowing, until I was already standing behind the podium, exactly who was sitting in the audience listening to every word of it. The invitation arrived by email in early spring, from the Dean of Student Affairs at a mid-sized state university I had no prior connection to, asking whether I would be willing to deliver a keynote address at their spring graduation ceremony, specifically for the College of Business and Management, in recognition of my work with the Second Chances Scholarship Program and my broader research into childhood development outcomes. The email explained that a member of their scholarship committee had encountered a profile of the program in a regional education publication some months earlier, and that the committee felt my story would resonate strongly with a graduating class that included a meaningful number of first-generation and non-traditional students who had overcome significant personal obstacles on their way to that stage. I accepted without much hesitation, having grown reasonably comfortable, by that point, with this particular kind of engagement, and gave very little additional thought to the specific details of the graduating class I'd been asked to address, beyond a general sense of the numbers involved and the standard logistical information the university's events office sent over in the following weeks. It genuinely did not occur to me, reviewing that logistical email, to check which specific programs or modules were included in that particular ceremony, or to consider, even in passing, whether anyone I knew might happen to be graduating from that same university that same spring. I want to be honest and say that if I'd had any reason to suspect Emily might be among the graduates that day, I likely still would have accepted the invitation, though I would certainly have prepared myself differently for walking into that auditorium. As it happened, I had no such warning at all. I hadn't spoken to Emily in over a decade. I hadn't spoken to my parents in nearly as long, beyond a handful of brief, stilted, entirely unsatisfying attempts at contact in the years immediately following the accident, attempts that had gradually tapered off into nothing once it became clear that neither of them was prepared to genuinely reckon with what had happened, or to offer anything close to a real accounting for it. The morning of the ceremony, I arrived at the university a couple of hours early, as I typically did for these kinds of events, reviewing my remarks one final time in a small room set aside for speakers, chatting briefly with the dean and a couple of faculty members involved in coordinating the day, entirely absorbed in the familiar, focused nerves that came before any public speaking engagement, with no sense whatsoever that anything unusual was about to unfold. It was only once I was led out to the stage area, waiting in the wings while the earlier portions of the ceremony proceeded, that I happened to glance at a printed program someone had left on a nearby table, idly scanning it the way you do while waiting for your turn, and noticed, with a jolt that seemed to physically stop my breath for a moment, a name listed among the graduates receiving their MBA that day, Emily Coleman. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, staring at that single line of printed text, my mind racing through a dozen different possibilities at once, a coincidence, a different Emily Coleman entirely, some statistical near impossibility that surely couldn't actually be happening on the exact day I'd been invited to speak. But some deep, old instinct told me, even before I had any real confirmation, that this wasn't a coincidence at all, and that instinct only solidified further when I finally allowed myself to scan the audience from the wings of the stage, searching the rows of seated family members for faces I hadn't seen in 13 years. I found them almost immediately, seated roughly a third of the way back from the stage, on the right side of the auditorium, my mother, visibly older than I remembered her, her hair now more gray than brown, and my father beside her, heavier than I remembered, both of them dressed formally, both of them wearing the particular, unmistakable expression of proud parents waiting for their daughter's name to be called. I felt, in that moment, a strange, complicated collision of emotions I hadn't fully prepared myself for, standing in the wings of a stage I'd been invited to specifically to speak about resilience, about overcoming family betrayal, about building a life out of the wreckage of exactly the kind of household my parents had built around me, a speech I had already written, already rehearsed, already fully intended to deliver, having no idea, until this exact moment, that I was about to deliver it. Directly to the very people it was actually about, sitting close enough in that audience to see, clearly, every single flicker of recognition that was about to cross their faces the moment I walked out from behind that podium. I had perhaps 10 minutes, standing there in the wings watching the ceremony's earlier speakers move through their remarks, to decide exactly how I wanted to handle what I now understood was about to happen, whether to soften my prepared remarks, whether to abandon the speech entirely and improvise something safer, or whether to do exactly what I'd originally planned to do, and let the story I'd built my entire adult life around finally be heard, in full, by the three people who had lived through the earliest and most painful chapters of it alongside me, whether they were ready to hear it or not. I decided, standing in the wings of that auditorium with perhaps 5 minutes left before I was due to walk out, that I wasn't going to change a single word of what I'd already prepared. I hadn't written that speech with any intention of embarrassing anyone or engineering a confrontation. I'd written it because it was true, because it represented, as honestly as I knew how to tell it, exactly what had happened to me and exactly what I'd built afterward. The fact that the people it was about happened to be sitting in the audience that day didn't change any of that. If anything, it clarified, for me, exactly why I needed to tell it precisely as I'd planned. I walked out to the podium when my name was called, and I remember the specific, strange calm that settled over me in that moment, a kind of steadiness I hadn't fully expected given the surprise I'd just absorbed backstage. I began the way I'd always planned to begin, with a simple, direct sentence I'd used in earlier versions of this talk. When I was 15 years old, my parents put me out of our house into a severe storm, over an accusation that was never actually true. I watched, from the podium, a visible ripple move through a small section of the audience roughly a third of the way back, though I kept my eyes moving across the broader crowd, refusing to let my gaze linger too long or too obviously on any single row. I continued through the story largely as I'd rehearsed it many times before: the accusation, the weeks of suspicion, the storm, the accident, waking up to find a stranger sitting beside my hospital bed who would go on to change the entire course of my life. I didn't use my family's actual names. I didn't gesture toward the audience or acknowledge, directly, that anyone specific was listening. But I also didn't soften a single detail, didn't sand down the sharper edges of what had actually happened the way I might have, instinctively, in an earlier, less healed version of myself. I described, as I always did in this talk, the specific words my mother had used that night: get out. I don't need a sick daughter, because I'd learned, over years of giving versions of this speech, that specificity mattered, that vague, softened language let audiences hold the story at a comfortable distance, while the actual words, spoken exactly as they'd been said, made the reality of what happened impossible to minimize or explain away. I glanced up, briefly, at that exact point in the speech, and found my mother's face in the crowd, pale and completely still, my father beside her with an expression I recognized instantly from that hospital room 13 years earlier, the same stricken, frozen quality, though this time there was nowhere for either of them to retreat to, no door to close, no porch light to switch off. I held that gaze for perhaps 2 seconds, no longer, before returning my attention to the rest of the audience, unwilling to let this moment become primarily about them, when it had always, ultimately, been about something considerably larger than any single family's private failures. I moved through the rest of the talk as planned, describing Diane's role in my recovery, the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding my sense of my own worth on a foundation of real evidence rather than anyone else's approval, and finally, the founding of the Second Chances Scholarship Program, explaining, to a room full of graduates and their families, exactly why I believed so strongly that a single, consistent adult showing up for a struggling young person could change the entire trajectory of that person's life, the way Diane's decision not to simply close my case had changed mine. I finished the speech the way I always did, with a direct address to the graduates themselves, encouraging them to think carefully about who they chose to show up for in their own lives, and to remember that resilience, real resilience, wasn't about pretending you hadn't been hurt, it was about refusing to let the people who hurt you be the ones who got to define what you eventually built afterward. The applause that followed felt, in that moment, both entirely genuine and strangely distant, my attention split between the broader warmth of the room and the specific, unavoidable awareness of exactly where my family was sitting, exactly what expression I imagined must still be on their faces. I didn't seek them out afterward. I didn't linger near the reception, didn't scan the crowd looking for an opportunity for some dramatic, cathartic confrontation. I gave a brief round of photos with university staff, thanked the dean for the invitation, and left shortly after, exactly as I would have on any other speaking engagement. I did receive an email from my mother about 3 weeks later, the first direct contact from either of my parents in nearly a decade, a short, somewhat halting message that acknowledged, in general terms, that the speech had been difficult to hear and asked whether I might be willing to talk sometime. I responded, eventually, with a brief, honest message of my own, explaining that I wasn't closed off to the idea of a relationship someday, but that it would require an actual, direct acknowledgement of what had happened, not a vague gesture toward wanting to reconnect, and that I wasn't going to spend any further years of my life managing anyone else's discomfort in place of finally receiving the accountability I'd been owed since I was 15 years old. We haven't spoken since, not because I've closed a door permanently, but because that accountability has never actually come, and I've learned, in the years since that graduation stage, that I'm no longer willing to accept less than that in exchange for a relationship with the people who once decided, on a stormy Friday night, that I wasn't worth keeping around. If there's a single lesson I've carried forward from everything that happened, it's this: the family you're born into doesn't automatically earn the right to define your worth, and sometimes the people who save your life aren't the ones who are supposed to, by any conventional definition, but the ones who simply choose, in a moment when it matters most, not to look away. I've spent my career, in the years since, trying to be exactly that kind of person for other young people facing exactly what I once faced, and I've come to understand that this, more than any speech, more than any confrontation, more than any long overdue apology I may or may not ever receive, is the truest form of justice I could have ever asked for. Thank you for listening to this story. If it meant something to you, please consider subscribing to Quiet Karma Stories for more real stories of family, resilience, and the people who show up when it matters most.